There was a moment in history when eternity came with a price tag. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. Forgiveness could be purchased, punishment could be reduced, and salvation, once framed as divine grace, began to resemble a transaction. This wasn't rumor or heresy. It was official policy preached from pulpits, recorded in ledgers, and enforced by the most powerful institution in Europe. For a time, heaven ran on receipts. This wasn't a fringe abuse on the margins of faith. It was a system carefully constructed, widely accepted, and extraordinarily profitable. If there were ever proof that markets can invade anything, even the afterlife, this was it. Nothing says eternal truth quite like variable pricing. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. To understand how indulgences became a marketplace, you first have to understand the position the medieval church occupied in Europe. This wasn't just a religious body. It was a transnational power structure operating across fractured kingdoms, weak states, and constant war. Kings came and went. Borders shifted, but the church remained. It owned vast amounts of land, administered courts, educated elites, recorded births and deaths, and most importantly, claimed moral authority over every soul. That authority was powerful, but it was also complex. The church was many things at once. It was a spiritual guide, a political force, a legal institution, and in many places the only safety net people had. Monasteries fed the poor, housed travelers, cared for the sick, and supported widows and orphans. Long before modern welfare states existed, religious institutions absorbed social costs no one else could. Charity was real, visible, and often life-saving. But charity was not what made the church expensive. The church didn't exist in abstraction. It built cathedrals, meant to rival heaven itself. It financed crusades. It maintained bureaucracies stretching from Rome to the edges of Christendom. It negotiated with kings, funded diplomacy, enforced doctrine, and projected authority across an entire continent. And unlike modern states, it didn't have a standing tax system backed by police or armies of accountants. It couldn't simply raise income taxes or issue bonds. It needed revenue streams that felt legitimate, voluntary, and spiritually justified at a scale far beyond local charity. So it did what every durable institution eventually does when faced with financial pressure. It monetized what it controlled. The church controlled access to salvation, or at least the framework through which salvation was understood. Medieval theology held that sin created a form of spiritual debt. Even after forgiveness, punishment remained either on earth or in purgatory. This wasn't fringe doctrine. It was mainstream belief, deeply internalized by a population that lived close to death and took the afterlife seriously. Originally, indulgences weren't about money. They were tied to acts of devotion, pilgrimages, prayers, charitable works. The logic was simple. Demonstrate repentance through sacrifice, and the church would recognize that effort spiritually. But over time, something shifted. Acts of devotion were standardized. Sacrifice was quantified. And eventually, money replaced effort. Cash was easier than pilgrimage, faster than penance, more scalable than prayer. What began as moral discipline slowly transformed into liquidity. By the late Middle Ages, indulgences could be purchased directly. Preachers traveled from town to town, offering reductions in spiritual punishment in exchange for payment. And this wasn't a flat price. It was a market. Rates varied by sin, by status, and by urgency. A modest payment, often the equivalent of a day's wage, might promise relief for minor offenses. Larger sums were encouraged for more serious sins, faster absolution. Or indulgences applied to the souls of loved ones already believed to be suffering in purgatory. Wealthier buyers were urged to give more, not because grace cost more, but because they could afford it. In modern terms, it was market segmentation centuries before the phrase existed. The messaging was clear and emotional. Why suffer in purgatory when relief was available now? Why leave parents, spouses, or children trapped in the afterlife when a contribution could help them ascend? The offer wasn't framed as greed. It was framed as mercy, conveniently priced. Fear became a revenue stream. This system scaled with remarkable efficiency. Indulgences required no enforcement mechanism beyond belief. There was no need to verify outcomes, no way to audit the afterlife. Trust did all the work. The church didn't need to chase debtors or threaten punishment. People lined up willingly, driven by guilt, anxiety, and hope. When salvation becomes transferable, demand takes care of itself. If there were ever a perfect product, it was one no one could independently test. Behind the scenes, the financial machinery grew more sophisticated. Revenue from indulgences was split between Rome, local bishops, and secular rulers who allowed the campaigns to operate. Everyone took a cut. Funds flowed into major projects. Most famously, the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, a structure meant to symbolize eternal glory financed by very earthly transactions. And this is where the system crossed a dangerous line because it stopped feeling like spiritual guidance and started feeling like sales. Pricing became explicit. Marketing became aggressive. Preachers like Johann Tetzel perfected the pitch, promising immediate relief with rehearsed slogans and emotional certainty. The more vividly sin was described, the more urgently payment followed. One famous line captured the spirit of the operation. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Nothing says eternal mystery quite like a jingle. When forgiveness becomes scalable, abuse becomes inevitable. And the people paying into this system weren't elites playing abstract financial games. They were peasants, laborers, families living close to the edge. For them, indulgences weren't theology. They were protection, insurance against eternal suffering. And when systems sell protection, they gain leverage. But they also take on risk. Because once belief starts behaving like a market, people begin to notice the pricing. They begin to compare. They begin to question. They begin to ask whether grace should fluctuate with income. And quietly, almost invisibly at first, trust begins to erode, not because people lost faith in God, but because they began to suspect the institution managing access to Him. The church had solved its financial problem, but it had created something far more dangerous, a moral imbalance that money could not correct. Once the church turned salvation into a transaction, it didn't immediately collapse. For a while, the system worked exactly as intended. Money flowed, projects were funded, authority appeared intact. Most people didn't challenge the idea of indulgences outright because belief systems don't shatter overnight. They fracture slowly at the points where lived experience collides with contradiction. The problem wasn't just theological, it was structural. Indulgences created a market where inequality was no longer merely social or economic, but eternal. Wealthy sinners could buy relief. The poor were left with prayer, fear, and patience. Grace, once framed as universal, now behaved like a tiered product. And markets are very good at revealing uncomfortable truths. Once pricing exists, comparison follows. Once comparison follows, legitimacy is questioned. The breaking point didn't come from Rome. It came from the edges of the system where the transaction felt most exploitative, and the justification thinnest. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther reacted not as a revolutionary but as an auditor. His objections were narrow at first. He didn't challenge the existence of sin, purgatory, or faith itself. He challenged the mechanism. He questioned whether the church had the authority to sell reductions in punishment at all, and whether money could meaningfully substitute for repentance. Luther's 95 Theses weren't a manifesto. They were a list of discrepancies, a systematic catalogue of where the numbers no longer made sense. What made indulgences uniquely dangerous was that they were visible. Unlike complex theological debates, indulgences came with receipts, prices, and sales pitches. They were public, tangible, easy to understand. When Luther criticized them, people didn't need advanced education to grasp the problem. They had already felt it in their wallets. The response from Rome wasn't reform. It was defense. Because by that point, indulgences weren't just a spiritual practice. They were embedded in the church's financial architecture. Too many projects depended on the revenue. Too many alliances were built on the flow of funds. too many powerful interests benefited from keeping the system intact. Admitting error wasn't just a moral risk, it was a balance sheet catastrophe. So, the institution doubled down, and that decision changed Europe. Once belief fractured, it couldn't be contained. Printing presses amplified criticism faster than authority could suppress it. Local rulers, already resentful of papal influence and eager to retain wealth within their territories, found political advantage in breaking from Rome. What began as a dispute over indulgences became a full-scale reordering of power. The Reformation wasn't just a religious schism. It was a financial one. Money stopped flowing to Rome. Lands were seized. Church assets were redistributed. New institutions emerged, aligned with local authority rather than centralized moral control. Faith decentralized, authority fragmented, and the monopoly on salvation collapsed. Indulgences didn't disappear because they were immoral. They disappeared because they failed to sustain trust. Once people stopped believing the system was fair, its revenue model collapsed. And when a system monetizes belief, trust is the only asset that truly matters. This is where the story stops being about medieval Christianity and starts becoming uncomfortably modern. Because indulgences weren't unique. They were an early example of something we see repeatedly. Institutions selling relief instead of solving underlying problems, monetizing fear instead of reducing it, offering symbolic absolution in place of structural change. When anxiety becomes profitable, there is little incentive to eliminate its source. Today, salvation isn't sold in churches, but reassurance is sold everywhere. Compliance fees, convenience premiums, guilt-based consumption. Financial products designed not to build real wealth, but to ease psychological discomfort. Systems that charge for permission to feel safe, responsible, or protected. Language has changed. The incentives haven't. When institutions price relief, they create dependency. When they create dependency, they gain leverage. And when leverage replaces legitimacy, stability becomes temporary. The indulgence crisis teaches a lesson that extends far beyond religion. Markets are powerful tools, but they are blunt instruments. They allocate resources efficiently, but they don't understand meaning. When markets invade spaces built on trust, identity, or morality, they don't just extract value, they reshaped behavior. Faith became transactional. Authority became conditional. And once that happened, the system couldn't be repaired with better messaging or stricter enforcement. The damage wasn't procedural, it was philosophical. The church tried to fix the problem by banning abuses, clarifying doctrine, and reforming practices. But by then, the core insight had already spread. If salvation could be priced, it could be questioned. And once questioned, it could no longer command unquestioned obedience. That's the deeper truth indulgences leave behind. Power depends on legitimacy more than force. Money can amplify authority, but it can't replace it. When institutions trade trust for liquidity, they gain short-term stability and long-term fragility. And when belief systems fracture, they don't collapse neatly. They splinter, evolve, and reshape the world in unpredictable ways. Europe didn't just change its theology after indulgences. It changed its relationship with authority, accountability, and individual conscience. The ripple effects reached politics, finance, and eventually the modern state itself. Salvation became personal, power became contested, and money lost its claim to the sacred. History doesn't repeat, but it leaves patterns behind. Whenever an institution sells moral relief instead of earning trust, it risks the same fate. When reassurance is priced, inequality follows. When belief becomes a marketplace, legitimacy becomes fragile, and when legitimacy breaks, no amount of revenue can buy it back. The indulgence crisis wasn't about heaven. It was about what happens when money enters places it was never meant to rule. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.